Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a topic that's, honestly, deeply fascinating but also incredibly strict: the South African law of succession. Think of this area of law like a super complex, completely unforgiving recipe. When you're setting up your final wishes, if you miss literally just one ingredient, the entire dish is ruined. It's a high-stakes rulebook, and we're going to walk through exactly how the whole thing works.
It's kind of a heavy question, right? What actually happens to your assets when you die? But, it's a deeply personal reality. What happens to your property, your money, the debts you leave behind, your legacy? Without a rock-solid legal mechanism, things would basically dissolve into absolute chaos. The law of succession is the legal framework designed to prevent that exact chaos, ensuring an orderly transition of wealth from one generation to the next.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the strict legal recipe. Second, capacity and the trap. Third, canceling or sabotaging a will. Fourth, distributing wealth. And finally, timing and backup plans.
So, kicking things off with Section 1, the strict legal recipe, creating the will, including all those formalities and rules. Let's look at the absolute, non-negotiable formalities required to make your wishes legally binding. Under Section 2(1)(a) of the Wills Act 7 of 1953, creating a will is definitely not a casual process. It is a mandatory sequence of steps. Step 1. It absolutely must be in writing. Typed, handwritten, doesn't matter, but it's got to be on paper. Step 2. The testator, that's the person making the will, has to sign at the very end of the document and on every single preceding page. Step 3. This signing must happen in the simultaneous presence of at least 2 competent witnesses, who then must also sign the final page. And listen, if you ever decide to change your will later with an amendment, which is called a codicil, you have to follow these exact same strict formalities all over again. No just crossing things out with a pen. This strictness builds into what the law calls incorporation by reference. Now, in South African law, this is a strict, undeniable no. You literally cannot write a beautifully executed will that says something like, "I leave my assets to the people listed in a private letter hidden in my desk drawer." It just doesn't work. Every single document that dictates who gets what must be fully executed as a valid will or codicil. The courts absolutely will not look at outside unexecuted documents to figure out your final wishes. Moving on to Section 2, capacity and the trap. Let's talk about who can actually take part. Now that we know the recipe, let's look at our cast of characters. You see, not just anyone is legally allowed to make, witness, or inherit under a will. Now, what's really interesting here is the clear contrast in the requirements. To actually make a will, you've got to be at least 16 years old and possess the mental capacity to fully understand the nature and effect of what you're doing right at the exact moment the pen hits the paper. But to merely witness a will, the age drops to 14, and the only requirement is simply that you're capable of testifying in court. Basically, the law recognizes that making the rules requires quite a bit more maturity than simply confirming you saw the rules being signed. But here is the massive trap you need to be aware of. Seriously, pay close attention to this. Generally, anyone can inherit, right? Even an unborn child. But if you witness a will, if you sign it, or if you handwrite it on behalf of the testator, you are legally disqualified from inheriting a single cent under that specific will. No way around it. Why? Well, it's a safeguard to prevent people from subtly writing themselves into an inheritance. If your will fails completely, you die intestate, and then your capacity to benefit is determined strictly by the Intestate Succession Act, which relies heavily on bloodlines, like your spouse, kids, or parents. But under a written will, you've got to keep your beneficiaries far, far away from the pen.
All right, Section 3, canceling or sabotaging. This covers destroying, canceling, and invalidating. Let's pivot to the drama of how a will is officially revoked or completely ruined. You can explicitly revoke your will by writing a new one that cancels the old one out, or by physically tearing it up with the real intention to cancel it. And remember, while you're alive, you can keep your will hidden away in a safe or a drawer, but the exact moment you die, a valid will must be officially delivered and registered with the Master of the High Court. But what if a will looks perfectly signed, but something sinister happened behind the scenes? Well, a court can declare a will utterly invalid if the testator's true freedom of choice was compromised. This usually happens in 4 main ways. First, mistake. Imagine the testator simply signed the wrong document or accidentally wrote "I leave my house to John" when they actually meant James. Second, fraud. This is outright trickery where someone lies to the testator about what the document even is. Third is duress, brute force basically, using direct threats and fear to force a signature. And finally, undue influence. This one is much subtler. It's mental manipulation, where someone slowly wears down a frail testator until the will no longer reflects the testator's mind at all, but rather the mind of the manipulator. Let's jump into Section 4, Distributing Wealth. We'll look at heirs, legacies, and conditions. So this is the payoff phase. How does property actually shift from the deceased estate into the hands of the living? The crucial point here is understanding the difference between the two main types of beneficiaries. First, you have a legatee. A legatee gets a specific, identifiable item or an exact set amount of cash. For example, if your will says, I leave my 2022 VW Polo to my niece, boom, she's a legatee. On the other hand, an heir gets the residue. They get whatever is left over in the estate after all the debts are completely settled and all the specific legacies are handed out. So like, I leave the remainder of my estate to my husband. Understanding this hierarchy is totally vital because if the estate owes a massive amount of debt, the heirs might actually get absolutely nothing, while the legatees still drive away in their shiny VW Polo.
Finally, Section 5, Timing and Backup Plans. This includes vesting, substitution, and accrual.
Now, getting an inheritance isn't always immediate. Sometimes it depends on time, like 5 years after I die, or uncertain conditions, like finishing a degree. This brings us to the concept of vesting, which is divided into two distinct legal moments. First is dice sedit. This is the exact legal moment you get the right to claim the inheritance. It usually kicks in the moment the testator dies. You hold the legal right, but you don't actually have the stuff yet. Then there's dice venit, which is the moment you can physically claim and receive the property. This usually only happens way at the end of the long estate administration process, once the master of the High Court is completely satisfied.
Beyond just timing, testators also build backup plans right into their wills. In law, we call this substitution. Direct substitution is basically a simple alternative. I leave my farm to my son, but if he dies before me, it goes to my brother. It's an either-or situation. But then you have fidecommissary substitution, and this brilliantly illustrates how you can lock wealth into a bloodline. I leave my farm to my son, and when he dies, it must pass to his son. You're literally dictating the generational transfer of that property long, long after you're gone.
And finally, we have a wonderfully intimidating Latin term, jus accrescendi. But don't let it scare you. It simply means accrual. Imagine you leave your estate jointly. Say you write, I leave my estate to my two friends, Thabo and Sippo. But unfortunately, Thabo passes away before you do. What happens to his half? Well, under jus accrescendi, Thabo's share automatically accrues. It adds onto Sippo's share, meaning Sippo, the surviving joint heir, ends up inheriting the entire estate.
So we've covered a lot today. The strict formalities, the massive traps of who can witness, how a will can be secretly sabotaged, and the mechanics of handing out the wealth. The South African law of succession leaves literally zero room for error. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative final thought. Knowing everything you now know about the incredibly strict rules of this recipe, is your own legal legacy in legally binding order? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to go look at your own documentation with a fresh, highly critical eye. Catch you next time.